Sailors, 1,293. Total men, 4,623. Armada of Biscay. Ships, 14. Tons, 6,567. Guns, 238. Soldiers, 1,937. Sailors, 863. Total men, 2,800. Armada of Castile. Ships, 16. Tons, 8,714. Guns, 384. Soldiers, 2,458. Sailors, 1,719. Total men, 4,171. Armada of Andalusia. Ships, 11. Tons, 8,762. Guns, 240. Soldiers, 2,327. Sailors, 780. Total men, 3,105. Armada of Guipuzcoa. Ships, 14. Tons, 6,991. Guns, 247. Soldiers, 1,992. Sailors, 616. Total men, 2,608. Armada of the Levant. Ships, 10. Tons, 7,705. Guns, 280. Soldiers, 2,780. Sailors, 767. Total men, 3,523. Squadron of Urcas, hulks or storeships. Ships, 23. Tons, 10,271. Guns, 384. Soldiers, 3,121. Sailors, 608. Total men, 3,729. Pataces and Zabras, small craft. Ships, 22. Tons, 1,121. Guns, 91. Soldiers, 479. Sailors, 574. Total men, 1,093. Neapolitan galleasses. Ships, 4. Guns, 200. Soldiers, 773. Sailors, 468. Total men, 1,341. Galleys. Ships, 4. Guns, 20. Sailors, 362. Total men, 362. Total ships, 130. Total tons, 57,868. Total guns, 2,431. Total soldiers, 19,295. Total sailors, 8,050. Total men, 27,365, plus rowers in galleassas and galleys, 2,088. Grand total, soldiers, sailors, and rowers, 29,453. The first point to note about the Armada is that it was almost entirely a fleet of sailing ships. The new period of naval war had begun. There had been hundreds of galleys at Lepanto 17 years earlier, but there were only 4 in the Armada, and none of these reached the Channel. The long, low, oar-driven warship that for 2,000 years had done so much fighting in the Mediterranean proved useless in the long waves of the Atlantic. The only oared ships that really took part in the campaign were the 4 galleasses, and in these the oar was only auxiliary to the spread of sail on their 3 full-rigged masts. The galleasse has been described in the story of Lepanto. It was an intermediate or transition type of ship. It seems to have so impressed the English onlookers that the 4 galleasses are given quite an unmerited importance in some of the popular narratives of the war. But the day of sails had come, and the really effective strength of the Armada lay in the 6 galleons of the 6 Armadas, or squadrons of Portugal, the Spanish provinces, and the Levantine traders. The galleon was a large sailing ship, but even as to the size of the galleons the popular tradition of history is full of exaggeration. Built primarily for commerce, not for war, they carried fewer guns than the galleasses, though many of them were of heavier tonnage. In those days every large trader carried a certain number of guns for her protection, but such guns were mostly of small caliber and short range. The largest galleons were in the Armada of the Levant. The flagship, La Regazona, commanded by Martin de Bertandona, was the biggest ship in the whole fleet, a great vessel of 1,249 tons, but she only mounted 30 guns, mostly light pieces. Compare this with the armament of the galleasses, and one sees the difference between ships built for war and galleons that were primarily traders. The largest of the 4 galleasses was only of 264 tons, the smallest 169, but each of the 4 mounted 50 guns. In all the 6 armadas of galleons there were only 7 ships of over 1,000 tons. There were 14 more of over 800, and a considerable number of under 500 tons, but the galleon looked larger than she really was. Such ships had high bulwarks and towering fore and stern castles, and they appear to have been over-rigged with huge masts and heavy yards. A galleon under full sail must have been a splendid sight, the bows and stern and the tall castles tricked out with carving, gold, and colour. Great lanterns were fixed on the poop. The sails were not dull stretches of canvas, but bright with colour, for woven into or embroidered on them there were huge coats of arms or brilliantly coloured crosses, and even pictures of the saints with gilded halos. From the mastheads fluttered pennons 30 or 40 feet long, and flagstaffs displayed not only the broad standard of the lions and castles of Spain, but also the banners of nobles and knights who were serving on board. But the tall ship, with her proud display of golden colour, was more splendid than formidable, and the Elizabethan seamen soon realized the fact. Built originally for the more equable weather of the trade wind region in the South Atlantic, she was not so well fitted for the wilder seas and changing winds of the north. She was, essentially, an unhandy ship. In bad weather she rolled heavily, and her heavy masts and spars and high upper work strained the whole structure, so that she was soon leaking badly. With the wind abeam and blowing hard, her tall sides and towering castles were like sails that could not be reefed, a resisting surface that complicated all manoeuvres. The guns that looked out from her portholes were mostly small cannon, many of them mere 3 and 4 pounders, of short range and little effect. So small was the dependence the Spaniards placed on them that they carried only the scantiest supply of ammunition. The fighting method of the galleon was to bear close down upon her opponent, run her abroad, if possible, pour down heavy fire of musketry from the high bulwarks and castles, so as to bring a plunging shower of bullets on the enemy's decks, and then board, and let pike and sword do their work as they had done at Lepanto. These were, after all, the methods of the soldier, the tactics of the war galley. It was the merit of Howard, Hawkins, Drake, and the other great captains who commanded against the Armada that they fought as seamen, using their more handy and better handled ships to choose their position and range, refusing to let the Spaniards close, and bringing a more powerful, longer ranging, and better served artillery to bear with destructive effect on the easy targets supplied by the tall galleons. It is worth noting that while there were more soldiers than seamen in the Armada, there were more seamen than soldiers in the fleet that met it in the narrow seas. If the Armada had a commander whose only merit was personal courage, the admirals of the various squadrons were all men of long experience in war, both by land and sea. Martinez de Recalde, the second in command and admiral of the Armada of Biscay, was a veteran seaman. Diego Flores de Valdez, the admiral of Castile, was an enterprising and skilful leader, and if his advice had been taken at the outset there might have been a disaster for England. Pedro de Valdez, the admiral of Andalusia, had sailed the northern seas, and Medina Sidonia was told he might rely on his local knowledge. Moncada, the admiral of the galleasses, was a first-rate fighting man, and de Leyva, the general of the troops embarked, who had taken command of the Rata Coronada, a great galleon of 800 tons in the Levant Armada, showed that he was sailor as well as soldier. The Duke of Parma, who commanded the army that was to be embarked from the Netherlands, was counted the best general of the day, and his 30,000 Spanish regular infantry were the most formidable body of troops then in Europe. His orders from the king were to build or collect a flotilla of flat-bottomed barges to ferry his army across the straits under the protection of the Armada, and for months thousands of shipwrights had been at work in fishing ports and creeks, canals and rivers along the coast between Calais and Ostend. The Dutch rebels held Flushing and the mouth of the Scheldt, and they had a small but efficient fleet ready to do good service as the ally of England, a fact often overlooked in our popular stories of the Armada. Parma had proposed that he should attempt to reduce Flushing and obtain command of the Scheldt, as a preliminary to the enterprise against England. The Armada could then run for the Scheldt, and make Antwerp its base of operations. But Philip was impatient of further delays. Though the best of the Spanish admirals were against him, the king insisted that the Armada need only run up channel, and obtain temporary command of the straits to enable Parma to embark his army in the flotilla, even from an open beach. in the